He wasn't a monster. Not at first. Byron Black was just another man walking the streets of Nashville. To most people, he looked like a quiet, distant figure. A man who kept to himself, worked odd jobs, and never made much of a scene. But behind the silence was a storm that no one saw coming. Born in 1956, Byron's early life wasn't filled with love or structure. He grew up in the shadows, in a broken household, surrounded by emotional neglect and violence. As a child, he often stared out windows for hours, barely responding when spoken to. Some called him shy. Others said he seemed lost. He struggled through school. Teachers described him as a boy with dead eyes. Smart, yes, but disconnected from the world. By the time he was in his teens, he had already begun showing signs of mental instability, blackouts, violent outbursts, but nothing was ever taken seriously. In a society that often ignores mental illness until it's too late, Byron Black slipped through the cracks. By his 20s, Byron had been in and out of low-paying jobs and failed relationships. He had no steady future, no real support system. The man was spiraling, and no one was watching. And then came Angela Clay. Angela was a mother of two and a woman trying to rebuild her life. She saw something in Byron, maybe someone broken like her. They began dating, and for a while, things were quiet. Maybe too quiet. Neighbors say they argued often, but nothing that set off alarms. He wasn't on the police radar. No one imagined he was dangerous. There were no restraining orders, no criminal charges. Just another struggling couple in a rough neighborhood. Nothing about Byron screamed killer. Until one morning in 1988, when that silence turned into horror. But before we go there, before we open the door to the crime scene that shocked America, it's important to understand one chilling truth. Byron Black was not the kind of killer who bragged. He wasn't loud. He didn't confess to friends. He wasn't a ticking time bomb you could see coming. He was worse. He was the kind of man who hid everything, rage, resentment, and emotional darkness, behind a calm, almost blank expression. He was the man no one noticed, until it was too late. And on one fateful night, all of that hidden darkness exploded into something no one could ever forget. What made Byron Black finally snap? What happened inside that house? And why were 3 lives, including 2 innocent children, taken in the most brutal way imaginable? We're about to find out. But be warned, what you're about to hear is not easy to forget. It was May 23rd, 1988. The house was quiet, too quiet. The neighbors hadn't seen Angela Clay or her daughter since the day before. No lights, no movement, no sound, just a sinking silence that seemed to hang in the air like a storm waiting to break. Angela Clay was 32 years old, a mother trying to raise 2 daughters, Latoya and Lakesha, both under the age of 10. Life wasn't perfect, but she was trying. She had a job, a roof over their heads, and a relationship with Byron Black, who had moved in months earlier. It wasn't love exactly, more like survival. 2 damaged people trying to make it work. But inside that home, something snapped. Around 5 a.m., the police received a call, not from Byron, not from a neighbor, but from a concerned family member who hadn't heard from Angela in over a day. Officers arrived shortly after. The front door was locked. Everything looked normal from the outside, but what waited inside was anything but normal. The moment officers stepped through the door, the air turned thick with death. Angela was found first, lying in a bedroom, a bullet wound to the head. No signs of struggle, no signs of mercy, just silence and blood. In another room, officers found her 2 daughters. They had been shot too, both in the head, execution style. Latoya and Lakesha had been tucked into bed, as if someone had wanted them to look like they were sleeping, as if someone didn't want to see what he had done. That someone was Byron Black. He didn't flee. He didn't fight. He simply waited. Police found him nearby, dazed, calm, as if he'd just woken from a long sleep. He offered no explanation, no resistance, just cold, empty eyes. When they asked him why, he reportedly said he was hearing voices, that something had taken over him. But those weren't the words of a man lost in chaos. They were the words of a man who had chosen silence over confession. The community was shaken. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't gang-related or drug-fueled. This was a man who had lived among them, gone to the same stores, walked the same streets, and murdered an entire family in the middle of the night. Angela's relatives were devastated. They had seen red flags in the past, moments when Byron acted strangely, stared too long, said odd things, but no one ever thought he was capable of this. The media exploded. Cold-blooded killer. No remorse. Monster in the house. But still, something didn't add up. There were no signs of struggle, no signs that Angela had fought back, no signs that the children had even woken up. It was as if Byron had planned it, waited for them to sleep, then pulled the trigger without a second thought. People wanted to understand. Why would someone kill two innocent children? Why would he kill the woman who gave him shelter, warmth, and love? No motive was ever fully confirmed. Some speculated that Byron feared Angela was going to leave him. Others believed his mental state had deteriorated beyond repair, but in court, prosecutors painted a clear picture. Byron Black knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't insane. He was cold, calculated, evil. As the trial began, the horror deepened. The autopsy reports were graphic. The timeline showed that Byron likely killed the children after killing Angela, meaning he could have walked away. He could have spared them. But he didn't. He walked into their room, looked down at their sleeping faces, and pulled the trigger anyway. That was the moment America stopped asking what happened and started asking, what kind of man does this? And that question still echoes to this day. After the trial, the courtroom fell silent when the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. The sentence was death. But death doesn't come swiftly in America, especially not in Tennessee. Byron Black was sent to death row, where time stretches endlessly. Days melt into weeks, weeks into years. And he would sit there for decades, not for days, not for months, but for over 30 years, locked in a small concrete cell with nothing but his own mind for company. That's where the transformation began. In prison, Byron Black was no longer the cold man who had killed 3 innocent souls. He was now inmate number 208,654, one of the many faces of America's broken death row system. He barely spoke. He rarely wrote. But every now and then, guards said they could hear him talking to himself, whispering to people who weren't there. At first, some believed it was all an act, a ploy to escape execution, to seem mentally unfit. But prison doctors weren't so sure. Over the years, Byron's condition deteriorated. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, depression, and severe cognitive decline. His lawyers argued that he no longer understood the world around him. But for the victims' families, those were just words, excuses. Their loved ones were still gone. 2 little girls were still buried in the ground. Appeal after appeal was filed. Some argued that Byron didn't get a fair trial. Others claimed executing a man in his mental state would be cruel and unconstitutional. But each time, the courts responded with the same cold message. The verdict stands. Inside the prison walls, Byron became a ghost. Other inmates hardly saw him. He never caused trouble, never lashed out, never cried, just silence, almost as if he'd accepted what was coming. But perhaps the most disturbing detail? He never apologized. Not in court, not in interviews, not even in private letters. No one ever heard the words, "I'm sorry," come from Byron Black's mouth. He aged in that cell. The man who once walked into Angela Clay's life with calm eyes and soft-spoken words had become fragile, hunched over, and eerily quiet. But even as his health declined, the memories of what he had done stayed sharp in the minds of those who lost everything. One of Angela's family members said in an interview, "We waited 30 years. 30 years for justice, while he got to live, breathe, eat, sleep. My nieces didn't. It wasn't just a wait, it was a wound that never healed. And as the years passed, the death penalty itself became a point of debate. Protesters stood outside prisons across Tennessee, holding signs that read, 'Executing the mentally ill is barbaric,' while others chanted, 'What about the kids?' The countdown to Byron Black's final day began several times, each time halted by some last-minute appeal or legal technicality. But eventually, time ran out. In 2024, the governor signed the final order. Byron Black would be executed. And so, preparations began inside the prison. The chaplain was called. A gurney was readied. Witnesses were notified. And somewhere deep within that prison, Byron Black sat alone in a cell, knowing the next time the door opened would be the last. The man who once tried to disappear into silence would now be forced to face the one thing he could never escape: judgment. The sun had barely risen when the prison clock began counting down Byron Black's final day on Earth. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Inside Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, the air was thick. Guards moved differently, slower, heavier. Everyone knew what was coming. A death row execution isn't just another event. It hangs over the building like a storm cloud, especially when it's someone like Byron Black. He didn't cry, he didn't scream, he didn't beg for his life. At exactly 4 p.m., Byron Black was given the opportunity to order his last meal, the final act of control in a life that had spiraled into horror. His request? A double cheeseburger, fries, chocolate milkshake, and a slice of chocolate cake. Simple. Childlike. Almost too normal for a man about to die for murdering a woman and 2 children. Some guards later said it was the way he looked at the food that chilled them the most. He didn't rush. He didn't savor it. He just ate slowly, silently, as if he were already halfway gone. Around 6:30 p.m., he was offered a chance to make a final statement. Witnesses watched from behind the glass, reporters, attorneys, and family members of the victims. Cameras weren't allowed, but pens scribbled furiously, waiting to catch every word. And then, he spoke. But not what anyone expected. He didn't mention Angela, not her daughters, not the crime. He simply looked straight ahead and said, "I hope this brings peace. I've said all I can say. I'm tired." That was it. No apology, no confession, just those final, distant words. A chaplain stood near him. He was asked if he wanted prayer. He nodded once, slowly. For a moment, it looked like a flicker of humanity, the ghost of a man remembering he once had a soul. At exactly 7 p.m., Byron Black was strapped to the gurney. Leather bindings over his wrists, his ankles, and across his chest. The 4th line was inserted into his arm. The needle sat there, silent and waiting, as the warden gave the signal to proceed. 3 drugs. 1 to put him to sleep, 1 to paralyze the body, and 1 to stop the heart. Byron didn't resist. He didn't move. His eyes closed, and within minutes, his breathing slowed, and then stopped. At 7:14 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Outside the prison gates, a small group of people stood in silence, some holding signs for justice, others holding candles for peace. But for Angela's family, it wasn't closure. Not really. It was simply the end of a chapter they never asked to be part of. A long, quiet death for a man who had stolen life from 3 innocent souls. The news faded quickly. Another execution, another name, another story wrapped up and filed away. But for those who knew the victims, who loved Angela Clay and her daughters, the story never ended. Even after Byron Black was gone, the pain he left behind stayed very much alive. Angela's sister spoke to reporters outside the prison the night of the execution. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just stared at the cameras and said, "35 years ago, we lost everything. There's no justice when 2 little girls are still in the ground." That statement hung in the air, like a truth too heavy to carry. The case of Byron Black became more than just a crime. It became a question, a wound, in the American justice system. People debated it endlessly. Was he evil or just sick? Was the execution justice or revenge? Can a man so mentally broken ever truly understand what he did? In the months after his death, opinion pieces poured in. Some condemned the execution of a man diagnosed with schizophrenia. Others called it long overdue. Civil rights groups questioned why it took over 3 decades to carry out justice. Meanwhile, advocates for the death penalty said Byron Black's story was exactly why the punishment still matters. But what truly made this case stand out was the silence. He never confessed, never gave an explanation, never told anyone what truly happened inside that house or why. He took that secret to the grave, and that left a dark hole in the hearts of those left behind. Angela's daughters, Latoya and Lakesha, were just kids. They never got to grow up, never went to prom, never saw a graduation cap or walked down the aisle. Their names became footnotes in a headline about a murderer. But to their family, they were everything. Photos from that time still surface online. 2 smiling girls, their eyes full of life, completely unaware of what waited for them in the dark. For many, the horror of this case wasn't just the act itself, it was how quietly it happened. No police chases, no gunfights, no screaming. Just a man, a gun, and 3 lives erased in silence. Today, their story is barely taught in criminal justice classes. It's not the kind of case that gets a Netflix series or a national memorial, but it should. Because Byron Black wasn't a serial killer. He wasn't a mastermind. He was the kind of man America often overlooks, the kind who slips through the cracks until it's too late, the kind who wears a blank face while carrying unthinkable thoughts. And maybe that's the scariest part. Not the killers who scream in court or write manifestos, but the ones who say nothing, the ones who sit across the dinner table, smile at your kids, and then quietly take everything away. In the end, Byron Black's last night wasn't just about a meal or a few final words. It was about what happens when no one listens, when no one sees the signs, when a broken man walks quietly into the lives of others and shatters them forever. And maybe that's why this case still lingers in America's conscience, not because of what he said, but because of everything he never did.